Thank you. So yeah, as Kara mentioned, I'm going to be talking about Puppet a bit from the kind of visual, conceptual point of view, and more about the business context behind it, and when you might want to use it, how you would explain to someone, because as we all know, we don't work in a vacuum. There's other people that we have to engage with. And actually, I'm not a sysadmin. I am a UX designer. So I'm one of the people that you may be interacting with day to day, who's a business stakeholder of yours or someone that you need to talk to. What UX design essentially means is, creating the front end, the very top layer of what people are going to interact with. So the web apps and the experiences that companies need to create to reach people, that's what people like me will design. And then it's the folks like you who've got to wire it up and make it actually come to life and make it actually work. And so people, UX designers tend to work with sysadmins every once in a while, and sometimes product managers, people on the product side as well. So we're part of that same ecosystem with you all. I live in Seattle. I teach a course at the University of Washington on interaction design, which means that I give a lot of slides, kind of like this one, describing different UI elements. Here's the iPhone, and here's the different components. Right, so people who are learning to be designers have to understand all the different patterns that we use. And so I teach how to create flows. And if you're a customer, you start from top up here and you go through the process, and you have to replicate that same experience on mobile. Cross-device is very important these days. People need to be able to have these experiences no matter where they are. And we design for single screens, between screens, the full interaction. This whole piece of the puzzle is something that I tend to work on. And I spent some time at Amazon Web Services as a designer there. And that was how I first started to realize what you all do. Because most of the time as a designer, you're just thinking about the interface. And you don't realize what goes underneath it and what the important pieces are. When I was at Amazon, I was working on at the time it was a sort of top secret stealth project. It wasn't released yet, and we were just cranking away on some designs. And speaking, by the way, of trying to explain cloud to your family, I told my parents I was working on a secret project, and they were like, oh, thank God, we don't have to try to explain to anyone what you do, because user experience design is also hard to explain, as it turns out. So I was working on a project at Amazon, and the developers in the other room were doing what they do, and they came in one day because the site was down. It wasn't out to the public yet, so it was no big deal. It was still kind of in the rough stages. But our general manager said, what's going on? Why is the site down? What is this? And the developers were saying, well, some of these servers are down because the Chaos Monkey took them down. And our manager's like, what? What is that? And so those poor developers trying to explain how, well, Netflix kind of popularized this tool that lets you go through and resilience tests, and it's random. And our manager says, which is a reasonable request. He's like, well, can we at least schedule when this is going to happen so we'll be prepared for it and I'll know when the site's going to be down? And they're saying, no, that's the whole point, is that it's got to be random. We've got to be unprepared. And he goes, what? And so there was sort of two things I took from that. And one is, I don't know what those guys are doing in there, but it sounds awesome, and I would like to know more about it. And the other one was, there is definitely a gap between the people who are kind of making managerial decisions and trying to run a site, and the people who actually know what the details are and that actually keep it running. And this type of gap in communication is not uncommon. I was preparing for this talk, as people prepare for talks, by browsing Reddit. And I found this post, which is, how can I tell if my system administrator is actually working or just slacking off? And I love this, because he's like, greetings, Reddit people, I understand this is where you hang out, and I have a problem. And this person, to their credit, acknowledges that they don't know anything about IT. It's not their area of expertise, but they're paying for this IT person. And they're trying to figure out, look, am I getting my money's worth? I see this guy tapping away, and I don't know what he's doing. So as you can expect, this person was met with a bit of sarcasm, right? Give him a 2-week cruise vacation. You'll find out really quickly what he does. Yeah. And the problem with computers, IT guy isn't doing anything. Nothing wrong with computers, IT guy isn't doing anything. Someone even said, well, you're definitely a manager. They've encountered this kind of perspective before. It's not so uncommon. And I think one that is particularly interesting was, well, your problem is trust. And you got to think about why you don't trust this person, how you two can work together a bit more effectively in the future. And you're all familiar with a lot of these DevOps practices and how people are trying to increase the speed at which work gets done and the effectiveness with which these practices can spread through an organization. And, whoa, my formatting is a little off here, but some of these surveys are showing that humans became the blockers of progress. Technology is rarely cited as a problem. It's the people who block progress. It's not changing fast enough. It's resisting change. And those are some of the big issues. So this calls upon the importance of communication to get your job done. Even when the technology is there and the advantages are there, it's kind of on you to push those advantages into the company itself. So I'll put up some further reading. This talk is kind of in the spirit of one from Puppet Camp last year about selling to managers and developers, which is always kind of an important topic. Developers are going to be a bit out of scope for today. I'm going to focus mostly on the management side or the designer side, the product people, the other cast of characters that you all work with. So let's talk a bit about how this plays into the type of work that you would do each day. I mentioned I live in Seattle, and Seattle people really like their coffee, so we'll start there. Let's say you want to create a simple web application to order coffee online. And if you were to create something like this, you all know what goes into it. There's all of the different components that you need to set up and to keep things running. And at the most absolute basic level, if you were to strip away and abstract away a lot of the complexity there, you're going to have a server and you're going to have a database. And, you're going to have some sort of platforms or components that some libraries that you work on top of it. There's the monitoring that you might add to keep track of all that's going on, the networking that keeps it all protected. And you may have some sort of feed-forward analytics for how your site works. This is all very abstract, just the piping, just the ductwork. But at the end of the day, this is about the level of understanding that you may need to get across to someone is, look, in order to keep this thing alive and pulsing, there's the ductwork we have to set up and the information that has to flow through it. And these are just the sort of list of components that belong in there. Now, it seems like, from the perspective of Puppet, there are a few key advantages that are fairly easy to understand. The Puppet allows you to know exactly what's in this environment. Each of these pieces is something that has to be configured, that has to be set up, and is a potential point of failure if it goes wrong, and it can cause this piping to get blocked or to not work anymore. It allows you to maintain the desired state. You can say, well, if I know exactly what this is supposed to look like, I can go through and change one of these elements to make it look the way it's intended to. And finally, to replicate these environments over and over. And this is a benefit that you may have already discovered, is that once you've got this drawing and everything looks the way it should, you can create it again, which is kind of exciting. There's another video you guys should check out, which shows some of the more intricate technical depth of Puppet Enterprise, but they use paper and kind of drawings to show it in a conceptual way. So that's an interesting one to check out. But most of you aren't just making simple web apps, right? You're doing a lot more than that. You're creating sort of full-scale enterprise deployments, or you're making the whole coffee shop, right? And what that essentially means is, you've got to keep track of things like the inventory and tracking what the customers are doing and making sure people can have a point of sale and pay for things and do the email. So all of these are under your purview and something that you are responsible for. And in this day and age, many of those things are digital, or they have some digital component behind them. And keeping all these digital systems running and happy and talking to each other, well, that's what's going to be your job. And that creates way more ductwork and piping. So the simple web app may be easy to describe, and sometimes if your business stakeholder is bringing to you, hey, I had this vision for an app, let's talk about it, you can really go through and describe all those components in a fair bit of detail and tell them what's going to happen and how, hey, we should use some of these tools because it'll automate the process, it'll make them faster. But for something like this, to describe the full scale of what you need to work on, it's a little bit harder to do. And in fact, you could say the advantages of using something like Puppet are now amplified because we have so many more touch points. There's so many more things we want to automate and want to get down. But as you may have already experienced, it's not always that easy, partly because there may be a different person who runs this piece versus that piece versus this over here, and they're all set up a little bit differently. So to try to codify all of this, it's a daunting challenge. And I think for people who don't do the kind of work you do, to see it kind of drawn out like that makes it very clear that, yeah, that's a tough problem. That's a bit of a hairball. And wouldn't it be nice if you could just like throw it out and start from scratch? If you've all read the Phoenix Project, there's a bit in there where they're like, boy, this is not how we would have designed it if we could just start over. Knowing what we know now, we would do things a little bit better and we would make things faster. It turns out this is an idea that people do talk about. The fancy MBA word for it is bimodal IT. Gartner, I think, coined this term, and they're saying, well, we're living in this era where these IT organizations are kind of splitting up. You've got one group that's trying to maintain the traditional infrastructure, the stuff that is kind of rock solid. It's been there for a long time. They got to keep the lights on. But then this other half is being charged with these brand new exploratory projects, these smaller apps that are potentially very high impact and kind of experimental and interesting. And those are being run a bit differently. And so those are being run with some of the more cutting edge tools, some of the more cutting edge practices. So there's a bit more about that if you want to check it out. But what that means for you is, if this bimodal IT concept exists, then having a stakeholder ecosystem that understands, that wants to understand the tools you're using, maybe a good place to start is with some of these brand new apps, these new cutting edge apps that are happening. So I'm going to touch on basically two types of your end users. And the first one that I want to discuss is, your upper management. And these are the gatekeepers. These are the folks that sometimes you need to get their approval, or you need to get their permission to buy something if you're using a tool that costs money, and some of the big decision makers. Some of you may not have this kind of person in your ecosystem, in which case you can take a brief nap. But a lot of you do. And the name of the game here is to try to convince them that what you're doing and reaching into their pocketbook, for example, is worthwhile and is going to pay off. So how do you do something like that? You guys remember the scene in Finding Nemo where they're trying to leave the anemone, and Nemo's he's like the IT guy or the developer. He's ready to go out into the open ocean. He's like, let's try new stuff, let's go. And the dad is like, no, we'll go out a little bit and then we'll go back in. We'll go out a little bit, and that tends to be how upper management operates a little bit sometimes. Kind of risk averse. They'd rather stay in their comfort zone, and if they're going to venture out, it's up to you to prove to them that it's safe and that nothing terrible is going to happen. So if you can find a way to ease into that process, that would be probably the best way than just diving straight into the cold water. So let's go to the next slide here. So back to our simple web app example, keeping it running. What kind of stats might we use to show that it's safe? In design, we have this concept called an A/B test. I'm sure you've all heard of it. It's used in front-end development as well. And you want to decide if approach A or approach B is better, and so you try them both out. And so for a tool like Puppet, there are a couple of stats that you can use to kind of bolster your case in this sort of comparative scenario. And one is the environment creation time. Now, in the traditional model, every piece has to be kind of configured and set up, and it's kind of manual, and it takes some time to really get that pipeline running and working as you expect before the system comes online. And if you can time how long that takes, you can compare it to, say, well, once we put Puppet into the picture and we kind of set up our environment how we wanted, we can get it up and running much faster. And that's a metric you can use to show, yeah, this seems to work for us. This is having an impact that we want. The other is response time when the system goes down. How long does it take you to figure out what's going on and actually fix it? And I'm simplifying a bit here again, but sometimes it's a matter of just testing each part and going in and checking and trying to figure out what's happening. And you may finally luck upon the right component and fix it and get things back online. But in a system where Puppet's kind of constantly getting information about everything and comparing to its desired state, it's going to automatically flip things around for you in some cases, which will increase your response time. And even in times where it doesn't, it helps to have that additional bit of documentation to go through and say, here's how it's supposed to look. Here's how it looks now. What might be the root of the problem that we're experiencing? Uptime is another one, right? You want the site to be up. And this is something that your business stakeholders care very passionately about. As Ryan mentioned, having downtime is becoming less and less acceptable. It's not something people want to have anymore. They say, why is the site down? What is the Chaos Monkey? What is this? This can't work. So when something goes down in the traditional kind of setup, how long does it take you to get it back up is the first piece. But the other is, what percentage of the time is it actually up? And can you show that having a tool like Puppet would keep something running, and that when it goes down, it comes back up quickly, before this other guy even comes back online at all? A couple more, and this is not directly related to Puppet, but it's kind of a concept you may have run into, which is that, sort of previously the way things are done is that deployments were very large and very heavy and very slow. You're putting a lot of code into the system and hoping that it's going to work. Sometimes that next deployment you run is going to actually break things and take things offline, and you'll push out something else. And so you'll end up with generally a lower frequency of deployments. Whereas once you run a leaner process, you can get more. There's one, and you get another, and you just kind of keep throwing up some lighter weight changes more frequently. And so this number, for a lot of folks, is actually very easy to show because you suddenly have a dramatically higher number of deployments, and you can argue this is a great thing because each one of these changes is something that the designer or the product manager or the business person wants to see in the app, and there it is, much more quickly. Especially if you can boast a higher success rate of deployments. Say we're actually getting this percentage of deployments in there successfully, whereas before we weren't. And the bottom line is, how quickly can your organization go from having this idea to generating value for the customer? And you don't want to be perceived as a bottleneck in that process. You want to be perceived as the enabler of that process, which is true. That's really the way it is. We, as non-technical folks, we can have all these great ideas, but we can't bring them to life without you all. So you want to make sure that that is communicated to the folks in charge. Here, these are the 5 metrics that I've pulled out that are interesting and fairly easy to gather. And if you're not already collecting these, you may have this kind of a problem, right? Where people don't know, I don't have any metrics, I don't know what this guy's doing. And so those are a few places you can start. There are some other ones too, and I'll put up some links of ways to get creative and think about how to make your case. There's some of these, how fast are the applications running? What's the time to market? Can I get something out there quickly? What's the onboarding time for some developers? If you have to explain your entire infrastructure to a new person versus handing them a Puppet file and saying, look at this, here's roughly how things look. Is there a way you could quantify that maybe and show that things are actually easier to get new people on board? The size of the change sets that you're checking in, smaller, faster. Sometimes you can tie that to expenses, maybe not, but if it's something you're able to do, that's always helpful. And even things like, collaborative spirit and morale, like, hey, we're working together more, we're automating the stuff we don't like to do, and people are happier. It's not as easy to put numbers on that sometimes, but if you can tell that story, it actually makes a big difference. Sometimes telling the story works just as well. There are some case studies for how people have used Puppet, and every company is a bit different, but sometimes if you can say, well, this company worked this way, and they created this process, and here's how it worked for them, even if it's not exactly right, it can still be very helpful for you. The sort of bimodal IT idea that came about, sort of 2 motivations behind it. One is that, there's so much demand on IT departments now these days that they can't really keep up with the old tools. They have to sort of evolve and change. The increase in demand creates this split. But the other piece of it is that now, applying better practices has such a dramatic improvement that the best way to see an improvement is to just not worry about the old stuff and start fresh. And the data is so compelling there, and it's so dramatic that you actually don't have to always have the most precise numbers in the world if you can tell a rough story. So if these business people you're working with are trying to make decisions, not necessarily going to question every little number. So if you're saying, well, I'm not totally clear on these numbers, but the story is very obvious. That may be all you need. You might be surprised. So, Google and Cloudera, I think when they started using Puppet, they began with just automating SSH. They started there, then they sort of snowballed it into something bigger. That's a story you could tell to say how that worked for them. Toys R Us, this is not a Puppet example, but they had a brand new position they created for, I think it was called the chief of e-commerce optimization or something, which was their way of saying, our e-commerce site is way too slow. We need somebody to figure out what's going on. And the way that they did that was, first they kind of took a pulse on the whole system. They got some new tools, and they figured out what a wild west it was. And they began with some really, again, some very small changes. They said, let's first figure out, what all these tags are that came from nowhere. Let's take the ones that no one's actually assigned to and get rid of them. So all these little housekeeping changes. And from that, they're able to generate enough compelling data to sort of keep the ball rolling. And at the end of the process, they had something like a whole governance team that would look at changes and they would oversee things, and they got into the flow of things working better than before. So the State of DevOps report has some of those metrics which you can use to get some ideas for what you might want to talk about, and same with some case studies to tell some more compelling stories. Second stakeholder, the business unit owners. These are kind of the keys to the kingdom, and by this what I mean is not the CIOs and CTOs and the senior managers who are making these choices that you have to convince and make a case, but these are the people who have the ideas and who are saying, this is your product manager, or this is the person who wants to make something happen. And in the kind of brave new world, ideally, you'll be interacting with these people a lot, and you'll be communicating your value to them. And if they like you and they like what you're doing, that's very helpful for you. And they're the ones with kind of the vision of hey, boy, I really wish I could make this app, and how do I do this? Can you enable this for me? So remember how before we talked about what goes into a simple web app, kind of in terms of components? These are what you could call the nouns. These are the things that you need in order to make something happen. Well, an alternate way to explain it to your business unit owner is more in terms of verbs. These are the things that we need to do and the actions we have to take, which can help them understand a little bit better what it is that's going on. They may not be as interested in all of the tools and the databases and the protocols and everything that's going on, because that's your job, is to know those things. And they probably don't. But what they do want to know, if they are being responsible leaders of their initiative, they actually want to know how all these verbs are going. They want to know, is this site online? Is it being updated? Is it being maintained? Is code being deployed? Are problems getting fixed? And you'll find that some of your stakeholders are more hands-on than others. Some really don't. They say, you take care of it, and I'll just stand back. But some of them really are interested in knowing these things. And oftentimes, the sort of the best leaders, the ones who can speak both languages, they want to know what's going on, but they're also willing to trust you. And so, you want to say, I'm going to create this system, and I'm going to hit each piece and make sure it's updated. If something goes down, I'm going to fix it. We're going to make sure code gets deployed and your changes get into the app. And we're going to be able to copy these and create sort of test environments where we can make things happen. And so we don't end up breaking stuff. So those are just really basic, really at the end of it, but they're ways to describe what you're doing in terms of actions. And there's sort of, the way I kind of think about it is there's a few different levels at which you can communicate. There's the very high level, sort of drilling down to all the technical detail. At the very top, you've got your strategies and your big ideas and your courses of action. This is where a lot of your senior leaders are spending most of their headspace. And again, the really great leaders understand all levels, and they can sort of move fluidly between the levels. But for a lot of you folks, sometimes you spend a lot of time down here, and which makes it harder to jump up and talk in these more conceptual ways. And what I've seen a lot is that when I was working with teams at Amazon, for example, the engineers who were able to earn the respect of their non-technical stakeholders and sort of have real conversations with them were able to move around in all these different levels. There's a tendency to, if you're having a conversation about the overall strategy and they drill in with a question, say, tell me more. There's a tendency to dive way down here, but what was usually helpful is go one level at a time. If they ask a clarifying question, explain it conceptually. If they ask more questions, go into the components. and kind of try to see where they're most comfortable and stay there as best as you can, or at least try to meet them halfway. We often would say, I was working on a project where most of the product folks didn't know much about cloud computing. They didn't have as much of a background on it. And that if the programmers went into terminal or command line, conversation's already lost. Not necessarily because the stakeholders couldn't understand it, but because all the decisions were happening up here. And so they were having trouble translating to that top level. This is a quote from a guy. He was a designer at BMW. And by the way, designers experience the same communication gap. We're trying to describe stuff that we just know it's right, and we can just feel it, and it looks good. And that's very hard to explain to a stakeholder as well. So he's experiencing this same problem with working between finance, engineering, and design. And he uses a lot of metaphors, tells a lot of stories, and says, look, everyone's got to work together like gears, and communication is that grease that kind of keeps the gears running as they should be. This is a diagram about the war in Afghanistan, and this kind of made the rounds on the internet a little while back, because it's like so ridiculous to look at. It's kind of a spaghetti PowerPoint slide from hell, and this was described as even the sharpest military minds were left baffled by this PowerPoint slide. It's a mind-boggling attempt to explain the situation in Afghanistan. And so there's, of course, some snark. This is what one of the military generals said: when we understand this slide, we'll have won the war. PowerPoint has become public enemy #1. And isn't this one of those optical illusion pictures? I think I see a llama on a snowy mountainside. And the reason that this type of diagram generates so much derision, people make fun of it, is not because it's not accurate. Because, it probably is a complicated situation. And some of you might be a little embarrassed right now because you have networking diagrams that are like 25 times as complicated. And think about how winning a war in Afghanistan is maybe more simple than that. But it's not because it's not accurate. It's because the ability to take all these lower level details and distill them into this top level is seen as a sign of intelligence. And there's a lot of government diagrams that fail catastrophically to do this. They just throw details and with no framework. And so that's why the ability to focus on strategies, focus on big ideas, courses of action is important. And you could even argue too that a lot of what a tool like Puppet or automation does for you is it allows you to take some of these, the scripts that you run and the metrics you collect, the technical stuff you do every day, and kind of turn down the volume on those so you have more time to focus on these top level issues. And that's a lot of what you're trying to achieve, really. The future and the new role for central IT or for these departments is kind of an intriguing idea that if you can not be interrupted quite as often, or if you can automate away some of these tasks, that hey, maybe there will be a bit more time to spend your headspace in those upper levels, empowering business goals, and saying, well, here's what I think we should do, and here's my take on it, and I've got a seat at the table, and I know what to describe, and making these ideas happen. There's a lot of the conversation right now about CIOs and what their future is that they're going to be some of the people, the empowerers, and they're going to make things happen, which is different from saying they're going to keep systems running and they're going to configure all their machines. A little bit different, right? A little bit of a different tone. And this is actually very consistent with what our Puppet Labs founder CEO was saying, that when he first got started writing Puppet, he wanted to build software that lets you focus on the fun things, the fun parts of the job, and kind of get rid of those tedious and annoying, interrupting parts of the job. And so that's one way to think about what the next steps that you want to take is, what are the parts of the job that you don't like, and what are the parts that are really interesting to you, and to try to turn down the volume on the parts you don't enjoy. And you guys are kind of the change makers here in many cases. I was sort of describing how it's hard sometimes to spread ideas. You have to communicate in order to make it happen. In the kind of consumer world of consumer apps, things go viral very quickly. It's so easy to share a video, but within a company, trying to share something within a company is much harder, and it often takes people who are on the ground and who understand their context and who know what their stakeholders are trying to achieve to actually cause ideas to spread. And so it's very important that you all are here and trying to do this. it's a really important thing, and it always has been for the software products that I've worked with, is someone's got to be the evangelist, or someone has to try it out and get some of those metrics and decide, is this worth time, is it not? So I'm really interested in this stuff, obviously, so I love to talk to more practitioners like you and people who are trying to make your departments function better and do more interesting things. So yeah, come find me, look me up on LinkedIn, I'll be around here at lunch, and with that, I will let you guys all eat some food. Yeah. Thank you.